The town didn't believe in monsters anymore. They believed in mortgages, traffic jams, and the hum of lawnmowers on Sunday mornings. They believed in PTA meetings and pumpkin spice lattes. But late at night, when the wind scraped branches against bedroom windows, some still remember the mansion beyond the woods, the one with iron gates that never rusted and windows that never let light escape. No one had seen him in decades, but every child knew his name. And on the morning of October 9th, when 70 figures in black coats appeared outside Riverside Elementary, like shadows given form, the town learned something it had forgotten. Some odes are older than fear itself. The bruise bloomed purple beneath her left eye like a storm cloud trapped under skin. Emma Harlow sat in the back corner of Mrs. Peterson's third-grade classroom, her small body folded into itself, hands tucked beneath the desk where no one could see them shake. The other children laughed during morning circle time, their voices bright and careless. But Emma's world had shrunk to the size of a fist, the one that connected with her face 2 nights ago, the one that belonged to a man her mother called a fresh start. She pressed her cheek against the cool surface of the desk and closed her eyes. Outside, October leaves tumbled across the playground in shades of rust and gold. The sky was that particular shade of gray that promised rain, but never delivered, heavy and waiting. Through the window, beyond the chain-link fence in the parent pickup lane, beyond the strip mall with its fading signs and the Baptist church with the crooked steeple, the woods began. And somewhere in those woods, hidden by ancient oaks in a fog that never quite burned away, stood the Ashford Mansion. Emma had walked past it once, 3 months ago, when she'd run from home with nothing but her backpack and a desperate hope that somewhere, anywhere, might be safe in the apartment that smelled like whiskey and broken promises. She'd only made it to the gates. They were tall, taller than any gate should be, wrought iron twisted into patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Vines crawled up the bars, black and leafless even in summer. The mansion beyond was a hulking silhouette, all sharp angles and Victorian darkness, windows like closed eyes. Emma had stood there for 20 minutes, shivering in her too-thin jacket, before her mother's boyfriend found her and dragged her back. But she'd felt something at those gates. A presence, a watching, not cruel, not kind, just aware. Emma? Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through the fog of memory. Emma lifted her head slowly, feeling every eye in the classroom turn toward her like searchlights. Emma, honey, are you all right? You seem very tired today. The concern in her teacher's voice was genuine, but Emma knew better than to trust it. Concern asked questions. Questions brought caseworkers. Caseworkers meant foster homes, or worse. The kind of attention that made Brian angrier, that made him drink more, that made his fists find her in the dark. I'm fine, Emma whispered. Mrs. Peterson's eyes lingered on the bruise, her mouth tightening into a thin line. But the bell rang before she could press further, and the classroom erupted into the chaos of recess. Emma stayed seated while the other children stampeded toward the door, their sneakers squeaking on linoleum, their voices rising in a cacophony of freedom. She waited until the room was empty, except for the dust motes floating in pale shafts of light. Then she stood, and she made a decision. The woods beyond the school property were technically off-limits, marked by faded, no trespassing signs that hung from rusted chains. But the fence had gaps, and Emma was small enough to slip through. The temperature dropped the moment she crossed the tree line, not gradually, all at once, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. Her breath became visible, small clouds that hung in the air before dissipating. The sounds of the school, the shouts from the playground, the whistle of the gym coach, the distant hum of traffic, faded to nothing. Emma walked deeper. The path wasn't marked, but she followed it instinctively, her feet finding purchase on roots and stones as if they'd walked this route 100 times before. The trees grew closer together here, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. Shadows pooled in every hollow, thick and almost tangible. It took 15 minutes to reach the gates. They looked the same as she remembered. Impossibly tall, impossibly intricate, impossibly present in a way that made her chest tighten. Up close, she could see details she'd missed before. Faces hidden in the ironwork, small and anguished, their mouths open in silent screams or prayers. Emma wrapped her small fingers around the bars. They were ice cold. "Please," she whispered to the mansion beyond, to the windows that watched without seeing, to whatever lived inside. Her voice cracked on the word. "Please, I need help." Nothing moved. No bird sang. No wind stirred the dead vines. Emma's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She was so tired of crying, so tired of being small and powerless and invisible to everyone who should protected her. "I know you're real," she said louder now. "I know you're in there. Everyone says you're dangerous, a monster, but I don't care." Her voice dropped to a broken whisper. "Because the monsters already found me." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the gates opened, not with a creak or a groan. They simply parted, smooth and silent, as if they'd been waiting for her all along. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stepped forward. The gravel path leading to the mansion was lined with stone statues, each one depicting a different creature. Angels with broken wings, wolves with two intelligent eyes, children frozen mid-dance. Emma kept her gaze straight ahead, focusing on the double doors at the top of the steps. They were carved from black wood, polished to a mirror shine, and they opened before she could knock. The interior was darkness absolute. Emma hesitated on the threshold, every survival instinct screaming at her to run. But running had never saved her before. She stepped inside. The darkness swallowed her whole, and then released her into a vast entrance hall lit by candles that burned with flames that didn't flicker. The ceiling soared overhead, disappearing into shadows. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of men and women in clothing from centuries past, their eyes following her movement. At the far end of the hall, a grand staircase curved upward, and at the base of that staircase stood a man. No, not a man. Emma's breath caught. He was tall, dressed in black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face was pale as bone, beautiful in a way that blades are beautiful. Sharp cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile, eyes that burned with deep, ancient red. His gaze locked onto her bruised face. Something flickered across his expression, something that might have been rage or sorrow, or both. "Child," he said, and his voice was like distant thunder, like stones grinding together in the earth. "You should not be here." Emma's legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand straight. "I need you," she said simply. "I do not help humans. I'm not asking you to help a human." Emma's voice shook but didn't break. "I'm asking you to be my dad." Silence crashed through the hall like a physical force. The vampire king stared at her, his expression unreadable, and for a terrible moment Emma thought he would laugh or cast her out or worse, ignore her completely. Then he moved. One moment he was at the base of the stairs. The next he was kneeling before her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached toward her face. He stopped just short of touching the bruise. "Who did this to you?" he asked, and his voice was so soft, so deadly quiet, that it raised every hair on Emma's arms. "My mom's boyfriend," she whispered. "Brian. He gets angry when he drinks. And he drinks every night." The vampire's eyes closed for a long moment, and when they opened again, they burned brighter. "What is your name, little one?" Emma Harlow." "Emma," he tested the name like a prayer. "I am Lucian Ashford, and I have lived in this place for 300 years. I have killed men who beg for mercy. I have watched kingdoms fall and cities burn. I have sworn oaths that can never be broken and made enemies who will hunt me until the end of time." He cupped her small face in his cold hands, so gently it made her eyes sting. "But if you ask this of me, if you truly ask this, I will become what you need, and no force in heaven or hell will ever harm you again." Emma looked into those burning red eyes and saw something she'd never seen before in any adult's gaze. Absolute certainty. No hesitation. No doubt. No conditions. Just protection, offered freely at any cost. "Please be my dad," she whispered. Lucian Ashford smiled, and a small, sad, fierce smile. "Then so be it." And in the darkness of the mansion, something ancient and binding settled into place, a contract written in intention rather than words. The candles flared brighter for just an instant, and somewhere deep in the foundations of the house, 70 vampires who had slept for decades stirred in their coffins. Their king had claimed a daughter, and the world would answer for every tear she'd shed. Dawn came slowly to Riverside, seeping through the gray sky like watercolor bleeding through paper. Emma woke in a bed that wasn't hers, wrapped in blankets that smelled like cedar and old books, in a room where candlelight still burned despite the morning. For a moment, panic seized her. The disorientation of waking in a strange place, the muscle memory of fear that came from too many nights listening for footsteps in the hallway. Then she remembered. The mansion, the gates, the vampire with red eyes who had promised to keep her safe. She sat up slowly, taking in her surroundings. The room was enormous, with vaulted ceilings and walls lined with bookshelves. A fireplace dominated one wall, filled with ashes that still glowed faintly orange. The bed itself was a 4-poster monstrosity draped in dark velvet, far too large for a child. On the nightstand beside her sat a glass of orange juice and a plate of toast with jam. Still warm, Emma's stomach growled. She couldn't remember the last time someone had made her breakfast. She ate quickly, then explored. Her clothes from yesterday had been cleaned and folded on a chair. When she opened the wardrobe, she found it filled with children's clothing in her exact size, dresses and jeans and sweaters, all in deep colors like burgundy and forest green and midnight blue, as if someone had been preparing for her. Dressed and feeling slightly braver, Emma opened the bedroom door. The hallway beyond stretched in both directions, lined with more portraits and lit by sconces that held candles burning with that same steady, unflickering flame. She chose left arbitrarily and walked until she found a staircase. Voices drifted up from below, multiple voices, speaking in low tones that carried an edge of urgency. Emma descended carefully, her hand trailing along the banister. The wood was smooth as glass beneath her palm, worn by centuries of use. The voices grew clearer, unprecedented. You swore you would never. I am aware of what I swore, Matthias. That was Lucian's voice, cold and final. Then you understand the implications. The others will see this as weakness. The hunters, Lucian interrupted, will do precisely nothing, unless they wish to test whether 3 centuries of peace was mercy or patience. Emma reached the bottom of the stairs and peered around the corner. The entrance hall had transformed. Where yesterday it had been empty save for Lucian, now it was filled with people. Except they weren't people. Not quite. They stood too still, breathed too quietly, moved with a fluid grace that was just slightly wrong. Vampires. Dozens of them. They range in apparent age from teenagers to the elderly, dressed in clothing that spanned centuries. Some in modern jeans and leather jackets, others in Victorian frock coats, one woman in what looked like a Renaissance gown. But they all shared the same pale skin, the same uncanny stillness, the same eyes that glowed faintly in the candlelight. And they were all looking at Lucian. He stood at the center of the gathering, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. Even among immortals, his presence dominated the space. The decision is made, he said quietly. Emma Harlow is under my protection. She is my daughter. The words seemed to cost him something. A ripple ran through the assembled vampires. Not quite shock, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding of what that word meant. The weight it carried. My king, said a woman with silver hair braided down her back, her accent thick with something Eastern European. We do not question your choice. But the child's abuser, he is human. We are bound by the accords. We cannot. I will handle Brian Garrett myself, Lucian said, in a manner that violates no treaty. And the school? This from a young-looking vampire with dark skin and eyes like amber. Word will spread. Humans will panic. They always do. Lucian's jaw tightened. Let them panic. But let them panic with full understanding. Harm comes to Emma Harlow, and there will be no corner of this earth dark enough to hide in. Emma's breath caught. The sound was tiny, barely audible, but 70 pairs of supernatural ears swiveled toward her hiding place. The vampires fell silent. Lucian turned, and his expression softened instantly. Emma, Come. She stepped into view, feeling impossibly small surrounded by so many predators. But Lucian crossed the distance in 2 strides and placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but unmistakably protective. "This is my coven," he said quietly. 70 souls bound to me by blood and oath. They are family. And now, so are you. Emma looked up at the assembled vampires, at faces that should have terrified her, but instead just looked curious, concerned. Some even smiled slightly. "Hello," she whispered. The silver-haired woman was the first to move. She approached slowly, then knelt to bring herself to Emma's eye level. "My name is Katerina," she said softly. "I have lived for 400 years, and in all that time, I have never seen Lucian claim anyone as his own. You must be very special, little one." "I'm not special," Emma said. "I'm just tired of being hurt." Something fierce flashed across Katerina's face. "Then you have come to the right place. Because we are all monsters here, child. And monsters know exactly how to deal with those who prey on the innocent." They convened in what Lucian called the Great Hall, a cavernous room dominated by a table that could seat 100. Emma sat at Lucian's right hand, still feeling like she'd stumbled into a dark fairy tale. The vampires discussed logistics with military precision. "The school will be the most vulnerable point," said Matthias, the vampire who'd argued earlier. He was broad-shouldered and looked like a boxer, with scars on his knuckles that had somehow survived his transformation. "If the humans see her as connected to us, they'll try to remove her. Protective services, law enforcement, perhaps even hunters disguised as social workers. So we make our presence known," Lucian said, "publicly, undeniably. Silence. You want us to reveal ourselves?" Katerina asked carefully. "My king, we have maintained secrecy for. Secrecy serves those who fear exposure. I do not fear these humans." Lucian's voice was flat, factual. "Tomorrow, when Emma returns to school, you will accompany her. All of you, you will stand outside those gates, and you will let them see exactly what guards are now." "They'll call an invasion," Matthias said. "Good. Let them understand the gravity." Emma found her voice. "Won't that put you in danger?" Lucian looked at her, and his expression softened. "Sweet child, I have faced witch hunters and inquisitions. I have survived wars and plagues. A suburban police force does not concern me. But what about the media? Won't they? Let them film. Let them broadcast. Let every predator in this wretched town see what happens when they choose the wrong victim." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding hers. "I need you to trust me, Emma. Can you do that?" Emma thought about Brian's fists, about her mother's deliberate blindness, about every adult who had failed her. Then she looked at Lucian, at the ancient creature who had knelt before a bruised child and offered unconditional protection. "Yes," she whispered, "I trust you." Lucian nodded once, then addressed the coven. "Dawn approaches. Rest. Tomorrow, we remind the world what it means to cross the Ashford line." The vampires dispersed, melting into shadows and disappearing through doors Emma hadn't noticed. Within minutes, only she and Lucian remained. "Come," he said, "let me show you something." He led her through the mansion, up staircases that spiraled higher and higher, until they reached the tower room. The windows here were tall and arched, curtly covered with heavy curtains. Lucian pulled one curtain aside carefully, revealing the pre-dawn sky. Still dark, but beginning to lighten at the edges. "Do you know why I agreed to your request?" he asked quietly. Emma shook her head. 300 years ago, I had a daughter, a human daughter, before I was changed." His voice was distant, lost in memory. "Her name was Lily. She was 6 years old when soldiers came. The war was endless then. I don't even remember which war. They killed her while I was away fighting." Emma's heart clenched. "I wasn't there to protect her. And when I became what I am now, I swore I would never fail another child that way. So I simply avoided them entirely. It was easier than risking that pain again." He looked down at Emma, and his eyes were ancient and full of sorrow. "But when you stood at my gates with your bruises and your courage, asking not to be saved but to be chosen, I saw Lily. I saw every child I have failed to protect by hiding in this mansion. and I could not say no. Emma took his cold hand in both of hers. "I'm glad you didn't," she whispered. Lucian squeezed her hands gently, then released them as the sky continued to lighten. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be eventful." "What about you?" "I will watch over you, as I should have watched over her." Emma nodded and let him lead her back to her room. As she climbed into the enormous bed, Lucian pulled a chair beside it, a silent guardian against nightmares. She was asleep within minutes, her breathing deep and peaceful. And in the darkness, Lucian Ashford, the Vampire King, sat motionless through the long hours until dawn, his hand resting gently on the head of the child who had called him father. 3 centuries of isolation ending with a single, desperate plea. By sunset tomorrow, the entire town would know. Emma Harlowe was no longer alone, and those who had hurt her would wish they'd never been born. Supernatural crisis at Riverside Elementary. 70 unidentified individuals surround school grounds. The footage was shaky, shot from a cell phone by an early morning jogger, but it was unmistakable. 70 figures in black coats standing in perfect formation outside the school gates, motionless as statues, their faces pale in the weak morning light. By 7 o'clock, every news channel had picked up the story. By 7:30, police had surrounded the perimeter, squad cars forming a barrier between the vampires and the growing crowd of panicked parents. By 8 a.m., when Emma Harlowe walked through those gates holding Lucian Ashford's hand, the entire nation was watching. Emma had dressed carefully that morning. A dark green dress that Katerina had helped her choose, boots that were actually comfortable, her hair brushed until it shone. The bruise on her face had faded slightly, though it still marked her cheek like a purple shadow. She wasn't trying to hide it anymore. The walk from the mansion to the school took 20 minutes on foot. Lucian matched his pace to hers, his hand warm and steady around her small fingers. Behind them, in a precise formation, the 70 members of his coven followed. They looked like an army, not threatening. Their hands were empty, their postures relaxed, but undeniably powerful. Each vampire carried themselves with the confidence of immortals who had seen empires rise and fall. Matthias walked at point, his boxers build intimidating even without supernatural enhancement. Katerina glided near the rear, her silver braids swaying with each step. The young vampire with amber eyes, whose name was Julian, moved with a dancer's grace beside an elderly-looking vampire named Chun who'd been turned in the Tang dynasty. They were legend-made flesh, and they belonged to Emma now. The crowd saw them coming from 3 blocks away. The murmur of confusion turned to gasps, then screams. Parents grabbed their children. Police officers drew weapons, though they didn't quite point them yet. The media surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward the approaching figures like talismans against darkness. Lucian ignored them all. He walked Emma straight to the school entrance, where Principal Hendricks stood flanked by 2 police officers, her face pale with terror masked as authority. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave school property immediately. This is highly irregular." "I am delivering my daughter to school," Lucian said calmly, "as is my right as her guardian." "Your daughter? Mr. Ashford, we have no records of you being—" "The paperwork is being filed today." Lucian's voice remained level, almost pleasant, but something in his tone made the principal step backward. "Emma Harlowe is under my protection now. She will attend classes as normal, and my family will remain outside to ensure her safety." One of the police officers, a thick-necked man whose nameplate read Garcia, stepped forward. "Sir, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you can't just show up with a small army and—" "Officer Garcia." Lucian turned his full attention to the man, and his eyes flashed red for just an instant. "I understand the situation is unprecedented, but I assure you we have no intention of causing harm. We are simply making our protection of this child known." "Protection from what?" Hendricks demanded, finding her voice. "Emma is a student here. She's perfectly safe." "Is she?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Lucian's gaze swept over the assembled adults. The teachers who'd seen Emma's bruises and done nothing. The administrators who'd filed reports that disappeared. the parents who'd whispered but never intervened. Because from where I stand, he continued softly, she has been bleeding slowly in plain sight, and not when you thought to ask why. Hendricks' face flushed. We follow proper protocols. If there were signs of abuse, we would have... There's a bruise the size of a fist on her face, Lucian said, still in that terribly calm voice. What protocol, precisely, does that fall under? The silence was deafening. Emma squeezed Lucian's hand, and he looked down at her, his expression softening instantly. Go to class, little one, he said gently. I will be here when you finish. Promise? On my immortal soul. Emma nodded, then surprised herself by hugging him, wrapping her thin arms around his waist and pressing her face against his coat. He froze for a moment, then embraced her carefully, as if she were made of glass. When she pulled away, there were tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. She turned and walked into the school building, her head held higher than it had been in months. Behind her, Lucian watched until she disappeared from sight. Then he turned to face the assembled humans, police, parents, reporters, all of them armed with cameras or weapons or self-righteous indignation. My name is Lucian Ashford, he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot without needing to be raised. 3 centuries ago, I was turned into what your legends call a vampire. I have lived in the mansion beyond these woods since this town was nothing but farmland and ambition. He gestured to the 70 vampires standing at parade rest behind him. These are my family, my coven. We have coexisted with your kind for generations, asking nothing, bothering no one. We have respected your laws and your boundaries. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But yesterday, a child walked through my gates and asked me to be her father, not because she wanted adventure or immortality or power, but because the humans who should have protected her had failed, because the bruises on her body were less terrifying than the home she came from. A reporter, a young woman with dark hair and sharp eyes, raised her microphone. Are you saying Emma Harlow was being abused? I am saying, Lucian replied, that abuse thrives in silence, and I am done being silent. So this is a threat? Officer Garcia demanded, his hand hovering near his holster. No. Lucian's voice went cold. This is a promise. Emma Harlow is under the protection of the Ashford Coven. Anyone who harms her, anyone who allows harm to come to her, will answer to us. You can't just... I can. Lucian's eyes swept the crowd. And I will. We are not bound by your courts or your laws. We predate them by centuries. But we understand justice in ways your civilization has forgotten. He took a step forward, and despite the morning sunlight, pale and filtered through clouds, but sunlight nonetheless, he didn't burn. Several people gasped. The sun doesn't harm me, Lucian said, answering the unspoken question. Most vampire legends are fiction, comfort stories humans tell themselves to feel less helpless. But I assure you, we are very real. We are very powerful. And we are done pretending not to see what happens in the darkness of your homes. Hendricks found her voice, though it trembled. This is insane. You can't just adopt a child without. The paperwork will be filed within the hour. I have lawyers, excellent ones, who have served my family for generations. They will ensure everything is done legally. Lucian's smile was sharp as razors. But legal or not, Emma is mine protect now, and we will remain here every day as long as she attends a school. You expect us to just accept this? Garcia sputtered. I expect you to do whatever you believe is necessary, officer. Call your superiors. Call the FBI. Call the military, if you like. Lucian's voice didn't rise, but it filled the parking lot like thunder. But understand this, we are not leaving. We are not threatening. We are simply standing guard. And if you have a problem with parents protecting their children... He let the sentence hang, unfinished but crystal clear. The implication rippled through the crowd. A father near the back, a tall man with graying temples, lowered his phone camera and spoke up. My daughter is in Emma's class. She's talked about her, about the bruises, about how Emma flinches when anyone moves too fast. His voice broke slightly. I'm ashamed to say I didn't do anything about it. Told myself it wasn't my business. So if these people, if they're willing to stand up when we wouldn't. He trailed off, but several other parents nodded slowly. Lucian inclined his head. Thank you for your honesty. The standoff continued for another 20 minutes. Police making calls, reporters shouting questions, parents arguing among themselves. But the vampires didn't move. They stood like sentinels, patient and immovable, their eyes glowing faintly in the gray morning light. Finally, a black SUV pulled up, and a woman in an FBI windbreaker emerged. She spoke briefly with the local police, then approached Lucian directly. I'm Special Agent Morrison, she said, her voice professional but not hostile. I need to understand what's happening here. A child asked for protection, Lucian said simply. We provided it. From those who should have loved her. Morrison studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the school building. Emma Harlow. We have a file on her home situation. Multiple reports filed by teachers, neighbors. Nothing ever quite stuck. It stuck yesterday, Lucian said quietly. Morrison nodded slowly. I'll need to interview the child. Standard protocol. Of course, but I will be present. That's not non-negotiable. They stared at each other, human law enforcement meeting immortal will. Finally, Morrison nodded. Fine, but this isn't over. There will be investigations. Questions. You do understand that, don't you? I have been investigated before, Agent Morrison, by inquisitors far more creative than your government. I am not concerned. Morrison's lips twitched in something that might have been a smile. I bet you're not. She turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, if the kid was really being hurt and you're really protecting her, well, the law moves slow, sometimes too slow. She didn't say anything else, but the implication was clear. Lucian watched her go, then settled into position at the gates, Matthias and Katerina flanking him like living statues. The crowd slowly dispersed, parents reluctantly taking their children inside, police maintaining a perimeter but no longer pointing weapons, reporters setting up for what promised to be a marathon broadcast. And the vampires waited. Inside, Emma sat in her third-grade classroom, her heart pounding but her spirit lighter than it had been in months. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. And everyone, from the principal to the police to the man who'd raised his fist against her, now knew it. Brian Garrett stumbled home at 11:37 p.m., 3 beers heavier and infinitely more reckless than any reasonable person should be. He'd spent the entire day watching news coverage of the vampire siege at Riverside Elementary, listening to reporters speculate wildly about the pale man who claimed Emma as his daughter, watching footage of 70 immortal creatures standing guard like some kind of supernatural army. It should have terrified him. Instead, it made him furious. Emma was his. Not legally, maybe. He wasn't stupid enough to think he had actual rights to the kid, but she lived in his house, ate his food, existed in his space. And now some freak in a black coat thought he could just take her? The apartment was dark when he entered, reeking of stale cigarette smoke and yesterday's Chinese takeout. Emma's mother, Jennifer, had left a note on the counter. Staying at Mom's tonight. Can't deal with this. Perfect. Coward. Brian cracked open another beer and collapsed onto the couch, remote in hand. Every channel was still covering the story. The vampire, Lucian Ashford, they kept saying his name like he was someone important, had given only one interview earlier that evening. The reporter had asked, "What do you say to Emma's legal guardians?" Lucian's response had been brief and devastating. She has none. Only predators she will never see again. The camera had caught something in his eyes when he'd said it. Not quite a threat, but something far more primal. A promise. Brian drained his beer and threw the can at the TV. Thinks he's so scary, he muttered. Just a freak in makeup. Probably some crisis actor Jennifer hired to make me look bad. The rational part of his brain, the tiny, shriveling part that wasn't soaked in alcohol, whispered that this was insane. That 70 people didn't show up to a school for a publicity stunt. That the FBI wouldn't be involved if this was fake. But Brian had built his entire life on ignoring inconvenient truths. He was 2 beers into a six-pack when he heard it. A knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate raps. Brian squinted at the clock, nearly midnight, and cursed. "It's late," he shouted. "Come back tomorrow." The knocking repeated. Same rhythm, same patient intensity. Growling, Brian hauled himself off the couch and yanked the door open, ready to tell off whatever neighbor was complaining about noise this time. Lucian Ashford stood in the hallway. Brian's beer slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled onto shore, no sound emerging. Lucian didn't move, didn't threaten. He simply stood there in his black coat, hands clasped behind his back, eyes burning red in the fluorescent hallway lighting. "Brian Garrett," he said quietly. "May I come in?" You can't." "This is breaking and entering." "You open the door. That's an invitation." Lucian tilted his head slightly. "Though if you prefer to have this conversation in the hallway where your neighbors can hear, I'm amenable." Brian's survival instincts finally kicked in. "I didn't do anything wrong. Emma's a clumsy kid. She falls a lot. Has she told you I—" "Stop." The single word cut through Brian's babbling like a guillotine. Lucian stepped inside, and Brian found himself backing up involuntarily, his body recognizing a predator even if his mind refused to accept it. The vampire closed the door with a soft click. "I can smell it on you," Lucian said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "The violence. It's in your sweat, your breath. It's soaked into the walls of this place. How long have you been hitting her, Brian?" I didn't. "Do not lie to me." Lucian's voice remained soft, but his eyes burned brighter. "I have existed for 3 centuries. I have tortured confessions from hardened criminals and listened to dictators beg for mercy. Your deceptions are transparent." Brian's back hit the wall. His hands shook. "Look, man, I don't know what she told you, but kids exaggerate. She's dramatic. She acts out. Sometimes you gotta discipline." You shattered a glass bottle against the counter and pressed the broken edge to her arm when she forgot to take out the trash. Brian went white. You backhanded her across the face hard enough to knock her into a table when she made too much noise while you were watching football. You locked her in the closet overnight when she cried too loud after you struck her mother. Lucian took a step forward, and the temperature in the room plummeted. "Shall I continue? I can smell every instance of violence you committed in this apartment. The blood doesn't wash out completely, you see, not from wood, not from fabric, and certainly not from the terrified child who absorbed every blow." Brian's legs gave out. He slid down the wall, landing hard on his ass, staring up at the creature that wore a man's face. "What are you going to do to me?" he whispered. Lucian crouched down, bringing himself to Brian's eye level, up close. His face was inhumanly beautiful and utterly pitiless. "That depends entirely on you." "I'll leave," Brian said quickly. "I'll pack my shit and leave tonight. You'll never see me again. Emma won't." "Not enough." "Then what? What do you want?" Lucian was silent for a long moment, studying Brian the way a scientist might study a particularly unpleasant specimen. "I want," he said finally, "to kill you. I want to tear your throat out and leave you bleeding on this filthy carpet. I want to make you feel every ounce of pain you inflicted on a child who couldn't fight back." Brian whimpered. "But Emma asked me to be her father. And fathers are supposed to be better than the monsters they fight." Lucian's jaw tightened. "So I will offer you a choice instead. A mercy I do not believe you deserve." He extended one pale hand, palm up. "You can die tonight, quickly and violently. Or you can live, but never as a free man." "What does that mean?" "It means I will let you walk out of this apartment. I will let you leave this town. But you will never harm another child. Never raise your voice, your fist, or anything else in anger against someone weaker than yourself." Lucian's eyes burned like coals. "Because I will be watching Brian Garrett. Not me personally. I have a daughter to raise. But my coven is vast, and we have eyes in every city, every town, every shadow you might try to hide in. And if you slip, if you so much as frighten a child, I will find you. That's impossible. You can't watch someone forever." "Can I?" Lucian smiled, and it was terrible. I'm immortal, Brian. Time means nothing to me. I can wait decades for you to forget, to relapse, to convince yourself you're safe. And when you do... He leaned closer, his breath cold against Brian's face. I'll make sure you die slowly. Brian's bladder released. Warm wetness spread across his jeans, shame flooding through him. But he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare into those ancient, burning eyes. So what will it be? Lucian asked softly. Death now, or redemption earned through a lifetime of restraint. I'll leave. I won't hurt anyone, I swear. Swear on your life. I swear on my life. Lucian studied him for another endless moment, then stood in one fluid motion. Be gone by dawn. Take nothing that belonged to Emma or her mother. And Brian? He paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. If I ever hear your name again, there will be no second chance. He left, the door closing behind him with a whisper sound. Brian sat in his own urine, shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down his face. He packed 3 bags and was gone by 2 a.m., leaving no forwarding address, no note, nothing but empty rooms and a lingering smell of fear. Emma learned about Brian's departure the next morning, when Lucian told her gently over breakfast in the mansion's vast dining room. He's gone, he said simply. You'll never have to see him again. Emma stared at her plate. French toast with strawberries, made by Katerina, who apparently loved to cook despite not needing to eat. Did you kill him? No. Why not? The question was small, almost ashamed, but Lucian heard the real question beneath it. Wasn't I worth protecting that way? He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Because you are not a creature of vengeance, Emma. You are a child who deserves peace, not blood on your conscience. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. I could have killed him. Part of me desperately wanted to. But you didn't ask me to be an executioner. You asked me to be your father. And fathers don't kill people. Good fathers protect without becoming the very monsters they fight against. His voice was gentle but firm. Brian will live with his choices. He will spend every day knowing he's being watched. That one mistake will be his last. That is a prison more effective than any grave. Emma nodded slowly, then surprised him by asking, Can I still go to school? Of course. Why wouldn't you? Because everyone knows now. About you, about what I am. What you are, Lucian said, his voice fierce with pride, is my daughter. Let them stare. Let them whisper. You walk through those halls with your head high, knowing you are protected by powers they cannot fathom. Emma smiled, small and tentative, but real. Besides, Katerina added from the doorway, a mischievous glint in her ancient eyes, Julian has been dying to meet your teacher. He has a theory that Mrs. Peterson is descended from a witch hunter who once tried to stake Matthias in 1847. She's not, Matthias grumbled, appearing behind Katerina. That woman had a mole on her left cheek. Mrs. Peterson's mole is on the right. You remember the exact placement of a mole from 170 years ago. Emma asked, giggling despite herself. I remember everyone who's ever tried to kill me. It's good practice. And just like that, the weight lifted slightly. The trauma didn't disappear. It would never fully disappear, but became manageable, surrounded by impossible people who treated her not as a victim, but as family. The school day passed in a strange new normal. The vampires remained outside, a constant presence that parents slowly adjusted to. Some complained to the school board. Others, particularly those who'd seen Emma's bruises and felt guilty about their silence, began bringing coffee and donuts to the immortals standing guard. Katerina accepted the offerings with gracious smiles, though she couldn't actually consume them. Inside, Emma's classmates bombarded her with questions. Is he really a vampire? Did you really ask him to be your dad? Are you going to become a vampire too? Mrs. Peterson intervened before Emma could answer, redirecting the class to math worksheets with a firmness that suggested she'd spent considerable time figuring out how to handle the situation. At lunch, Emma sat alone at first, old habits dying hard. Then a girl named Sophie slid onto the bench across from her. My dad says your dad is scary. Sophie said bluntly. But he also says scary isn't always bad. He's a Marine. He'd know. Emma blinked. I guess. So are you okay? Like really okay? And there it was. The question no one had asked before. Not teachers, not neighbors, not even her own mother. Emma's eyes stung, but she nodded. Yeah, I'm really okay now. Sophie smiled. Cool. Want to play tetherball after lunch? Okay. It was that simple. That impossibly, beautifully simple. That evening, as Emma did homework in the mansion's library, Lucian stood at the window overlooking the grounds. Matthias joined him, arms crossed. The FBI interviewed Emma today, he said quietly. Morrison seemed satisfied that she's safe. Good. There will be more scrutiny. Courts, custody hearings, psychologists. Let them come. Matthias was quiet for a moment. You've changed, my king. In one day, you've risked everything we've built. Our secrecy, our safety. Was any of it worth preserving if we couldn't protect one child? Lucian's voice was soft, but absolute. We've hidden for so long, Matthias. Telling ourselves it was wisdom, caution, but it was cowardice. And now we stand in the light. Lucian turned from the window, his eyes bright, not as monsters, as guardians. If that brings hunters, so be it. I am tired of being harmless. Matthias smiled slowly. The others feel the same. Julian has already started training routines. Chun suggested we establish a formal protection network for vulnerable children throughout the region. See to it. As Matthias left, Emma appeared in the doorway, clutching a well-worn teddy bear. Can't sleep? Lucian asked gently. She shook her head. I keep thinking Brian will come back, that I'll wake up and this will have been a dream. Lucian crossed to her and knelt. Emma, look at me. She did. This is real. You are safe. And I swear on 3 centuries of existence, on every oath I have ever sworn and every soul I have ever protected. No one will take you from this house. No one will harm you again. Emma threw her arms around his neck, and he held her carefully, this fragile, brave little human who had walked through his gates and changed everything. Thank you, Dad, she whispered. Lucian's eyes closed, and for the first time in 300 years, he allowed himself to cry, silent tears for the daughter he'd lost and the daughter he'd found. You're welcome, my darling girl, he whispered back. You're welcome.